Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is part of a special series in which Polaris Live invited 7 experts from the US, China, and the Middle East to offer their perspectives on U.S.-China relations and on the recently concluded 20th Communist Party conference in Beijing. These programs are brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. My guest today on Polaris Live is Secretary Chuck Hagel. Secretary Hagel is an American military veteran, former politician who served as a U.S. Senator from Nebraska and as the 24th United States Secretary of Defense, a recipient of 2 Purple Hearts while an infantry squad leader in the Vietnam War. Secretary Hagel returned home to start careers in business and politics. He co-founded Vanguard Cellular. Hagel previously served as a professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, chairman of the Atlantic Council, and co-chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. He's the author of America, Our Next Chapter, Tough Questions, Straight Answers. Please welcome Secretary Hagel.
Sarwar, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be with you and always enlightening.
Well, I would say the same thing, only I'd multiply that by 10. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for appearing. You know, I wanted to start by saying, before your career as a U.S. Senator, you were a successful businessman. You traveled to China to solicit business before many of us could even spell China. So why did you take that initiative? And if I might ask you, what did it teach you about the Chinese business philosophy and Chinese businessmen and women?
Well, Sarwar, I was in the Reagan administration. I was deputy administrator of the Veterans Administration. That was before it was a cabinet position. And I was the number 2 guy there. And that was during a time when Ronald Reagan came in, when there was a lot of question about Agent Orange and influences of things, impacts on Vietnam veterans. Did it hurt them? Was a problem? Were there going to be problems down the road with health? And the administration was cutting a lot of that funding, especially for Agent Orange. So I was the highest ranking Vietnam veteran in the Reagan administration. And I went to the president and told the president that I couldn't support these policies. And I was going to resign if we didn't change them. Well, they didn't change, so I resigned. And I admired Ronald Reagan very much and liked him very much. I was very involved in his campaign. So after I resigned, my friends had said to me, if you resign, you know, your political future's over. I mean, you'll never get another phone call returned in this town. And for 6 months, I didn't. I couldn't get a job. Then one day, 2 friends of mine who had been in the cable television business came to me and said, have you heard anything about this new technology that's been unleashed because of the court decision on breaking up the monopoly, AT&T, this new technology called cellular, which was basically wireless telephony? And I said, no, but let me look at it. So I went to friends of mine up in New York, other places that knew about technology, and I agreed to become a partner with these guys. I didn't have any money. So I sold my car. I sold 2 life insurance companies. I mean, not companies, but policies I had, and came up with $5,000. They made me president and CEO, and we started a cellular telephone company and got investors to invest with us to engineer the applications. One of the things that I thought about was, if cellular wireless telephony is good for the United States, and we had the best telephone system in the world, then what about the international? Countries like China that had no telephone service because the infrastructure was too expensive. This technology allowed them to leapfrog ahead of everybody. And so I set out on a course of trying to sell wireless telephony to developing countries. I started an international company called Communications Corporation International. I got Motorola, an engineer with Motorola, to go with me and two of my engineers to China. And this was we arrived in Beijing on January 1st, 1984. 1984. We were on the first flight. United started flying one flight a week from New York to Beijing and then back from Beijing to New York once a week. And we were on that first flight. I was in China for 3 weeks, Sarwar, all over. Tianjin, Beijing, Shanghai. And things were not really very good shape in China in 1984. We were greeted at the airport with Mao suited guards, all carrying submachine guns. We were the only commercial flight on the tarmac. But as we went all over China on trains, other means of communication, and transportation, I had a senior Chinese engineer say to me one day after I'd made a presentation, and we got a lot of attention. He walked me out and he said, "Mr. Hagel, your presentation is very interesting, but," he said, "you must remember one thing about the Chinese. We're a society, we're a culture of thousands of years old.
Wow.
And we are patient. We're very patient people. We know what we want when we get there. We know how we'll achieve it. We take our time. We're very smart about it all. And when we're ready to go, we're ready to go." I've never forgotten that, Sarwar. And all the times I've been back to China as Secretary of Defense, as a businessman again, as a United States Senator. And that advice was very good advice.
Well, it certainly has proven to be over the years, hasn't it, Mr. Secretary? So I'm going to follow up on that and ask you. I'm tangenting a bit to your time in the Pentagon. One of the themes, as you know, in Polaris Live, we try to talk to more people from Asia, rest of the world, and America, because I think we get enough from our own news media, which is the best in the world, I believe. But one of the things that recurs in my talk with Asians is that they are highly appreciative of the fact that America stepped in and kept the peace, basically preventing them when they were rather poor countries from spending money on defense. And one of them even said, that was such a wonderful free ride because it helped us develop to where we are now. But then the same people say, listen, but now that we have flourishing economies, we need America to be focused on engaging with us to build skyscrapers and highways and airports. We don't want to get that involved again in tanks and machine guns and so on. How do you read that? Do you think that it's driven by us disengaging from some of the pacts and so on? How do you read those signs, Mr. Secretary?
Well, the response that you were getting, Sarwar, I think is predictable. Most countries want to become economically prosperous for many reasons. It helps the standard of living, increases the standard of living, education, exchange programs, makes them more prosperous, more options, more opportunities, more hope, especially the smaller countries that have not done well in history and over the years. So I'm not surprised that you would hear that. And I heard that as Secretary of Defense because I took more trips to the Indo-Pacific than John Kerry did. during the same time John was Secretary of State and I was Secretary of Defense. So I put a lot of time into the Indo-Pacific and visited all the countries. ASEAN meetings, I for the first time, no one had ever done this, I invited all members of the ASEAN community, all ministers of defense, to Hawaii for a 3-day conference. And so half of that conference was dedicated to military, yes, absolutely, but the other half was devoted to economics. And this was the ministers of defense. I had the Deputy Secretary of Commerce come out. I had the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture come out. I had a number of civilian agencies dedicated to assisting our allies across the board come out and talk about opportunities working with us, that we could do more for these countries. And so half of that 3-day conference of ASEAN defense ministers in Hawaii was devoted not to defense, to the tanks and the planes,
Wow.
but to their economy and to their progress,
Right.
in so many areas. So I saw the interest then, back in 2014. I think that also cuts to something that I've always believed in foreign policy, especially, but in working with all people and trying to bridge differences. And that is that we should focus on where we agree. If you start out focusing on where we disagree, you'll never get to where we agree. It won't happen. And so where we can agree, and that was the post-Cold War world order that we built 75 years ago. I mean, we, the United States, led building that order with our allies. But it was a world order based on rule, based on law, based on common interests. It wasn't going to solve everything. I mean, the coalitions of common interest that we built, the United Nations, IMF, World Bank, defense, NATO, dozens of international development institutions and banks in countries, all on the predicate of common interests, where we can agree, and then we'll work on where we disagree.
Right.
So what you were picking up and you're hearing, I'm not surprised by that. Now, 75 years later, after the beginning of the post-World War II world order, it's a different world. I mean, China was on its knees. I mean, you go around the world, there was no economy that was upright after World War II except the United States. So it's a different time, and we've got to adjust and adapt to a different time. That doesn't mean that our standards of living in the United States have to decrease, not at all. It doesn't mean that we have to give up who we are or what we believe, not at all. But I think we have to listen more. And I think the real problems that we've gotten ourselves into, not the only ones, but have been problems where we got into situations where the military led the diplomatic. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, all three of those, in my opinion, were disasters. Not for all the same reasons, for different reasons, but there was one common denominator in all that, in all three of those wars. We didn't understand the people of Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq. We didn't understand their culture. We didn't understand their language, their religion. And we thought the almighty power, shock and awe of the American military would change everything. Well, it didn't. And for 3 long wars, 2 of them our longest, 20-year wars, Vietnam 10, we learned a hard lesson. Now, I'm not discounting the importance of our military, the strength of our military. In my opinion, it must continue to be second to none in the world, because that is a guarantor, not the only guarantor, but a guarantor of freedom. It's also economics. It's also relationships. I mean, we couldn't project the power we project around the world if we didn't have allies, because the allies let us station our troops there in their land. We've got ports and harbors where we can use to put our naval vessels for maintenance, port calls, airstrips, landings. If we didn't have those, we couldn't project power, and it would be a much more riskier world and a less safe world. So when you add all that up, I think, Sarwar, it connects to what you're hearing from our Indo-Pacific partners and other nations. But last point again, I'll just restate, and I think this is really important. We're always having to adjust and adapt because yesterday's gone, today's gone. It's all about tomorrow. Where is tomorrow going? Where is China going? Where's Japan going? Australia going? And that's what we have to stay focused on. And that's diplomacy, that's economic strength, and that's military strength.
And it's a perfect way to tangent into something that I just picked up this morning from my interlocutor, who's a very well-known professor in China and also advises the Chinese Communist government. He said, we could spend quite a few minutes talking about the gun problem in America and how you people go around shooting yourselves and how is it possible to talk to such an uncivilized country. I'm paraphrasing. And so on. And I said, let me point out, that this is something that's in the Constitution, and the president can't just will this thing away. You have to change the Constitution to do it. So and so on. And he said, precisely the point. He said, now we just finished our conference, and Xi Jinping was appointed to a third unprecedented term, and we've done nothing but criticism on it by the West. He said, why do we have to, and this is the point I'm coming to, and I thought you'd like to react to it. He said, why do we have to bring up these issues on which we disagree when we sit at a table? Why can't we take issues on which we agree and keep moving ahead? He said, why are you bashing us on the head because Mr. Xi Jinping, got into a third term? He said it's in many ways leads to a more stable situation than what we are seeing in America, where things 2 months from now might be completely different. I just wondered how you react to that, because he seems to be making the same point that, hey, if we move along with put some things on the side to be picked up later, we can make progress in our relations. What do you think? Does that make any sense?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as your friend did. China is a repressive government, is a repressive country.
Right.
We have always been, especially since World War II, the world's champion for human rights. Now, we're imperfect. We didn't get it all right the first time either. I mean, we have 27 amendments to our Constitution because we're still working on trying to correct things. But we can self-correct. And we do have freedoms. And we do have personal liberties. And we do have options. China doesn't. And so if we just close our eyes to all that, the repressiveness of their governments, and this government is repressive under Xi, as probably any they've had, and it's getting worse. By the way, not more freedoms. The autocracy, the control of everything. I mean, anybody who thinks that China commercially, economically, trade-wise is separate from the government, they're just not smelling the coffee. I mean, the latest indictments yesterday by Attorney General Garland of what the Justice Department maintains the Chinese espionage experts were doing in this country regarding Huawei and so on and so on. But that goes on and on and on. So, So we do believe this country, the United States of America, as imperfect as we are, in personal liberties and freedoms, that's a problem for China. And that's a problem for us because as much as we want to connect economics and common interest of everybody benefiting, everybody in China doesn't benefit. Everybody in China does not benefit. I mean, China's got a 1.3 billion population, acknowledging that they've got a middle class that's bigger than the entire American population. That's pretty significant. But what you're seeing in the Xi government, you're seeing that power develop, coalesce in the hands of fewer people, in particular one person. As General Secretary Xi has just got himself 5 more years in the legal process that they use, which is unprecedented. He has wiped out everybody on that 7-member standing committee of the 22-member Politburo. So he's also in charge of the military. So he is firmly in control of everything. And I think that's going to be more and more of a problem for us in the world,
right,
as we move along. So I don't see it the same way your friend does at all. Recognize what I said earlier about trying to focus on where we can agree, where we can cooperate, but that's not at the expense of what's going on with the Uyghurs in Western China,
right,
and the persecution of a lot of people in China. I mean, as imperfect as we are, we are a nation of laws. As you reminded him, we have a constitution. Yes, democracy is messy, and it's particularly messy now with our polarization and our political divide. Yes. But I'd still take our way of life versus an authoritarian way of life where people don't have any rights.
no,
And
no,
I hope we'll be able to continue to work through that, but
yes,
it's a two-way street.
absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more that there are some things that are built into the DNA of this country that that we're not going to be able to give up on. But how do you feel about? I just wrote this report in which I said, we are at political. We've gone into political, our own political corners on the political side. So why don't we now, seeing that the business and financial people on both countries are moving ahead very rapidly to consolidate in each other's, why don't we let the businessmen and women run the show let them lead and let the political side stand back, not giving up on any of these the things that we cherish and hold so dear. Do you think case can be made for that?
Well, I'd like that to happen, Sarwar. I'd be very supportive of that. But the fact is, like I've said, private business in China isn't private business. I mean, you've seen the persecutions of some of the leaders of Chinese corporations, not just recently, but over the last couple of years. It's gotten more repressive. So there is no real free enterprise system in China. There is a free enterprise system here. Yes, they have regulations to deal with. They have tax issues to deal with, but it's free enterprise. And a lot of politicians in this country don't think we should have such free enterprise. But China doesn't. If China had a system more like ours, where there really is free enterprise, so you would allow the business people in China and the United States to kind of focus on developing a better world for all people, and tell the government people and the politicians, you guys step back a bit and let us try to figure some things out. I'd be all for that. But that can't work with
Right.
that China has.
Let me tangent a bit to the military side, if I may. I mean, there are two views on this subject, that China wants to become a global power. The other side says no, for many reasons. They want to make sure they're never invaded again, right? And their budget, which is about a third of ours, best we know, seems to move on the side of those who believe that they just want to be the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific, but don't have global dreams. In your career in the military, did you get any sense for this? You've been there very often, as you've mentioned. Can you add anything to this discussion?
Well, I'm no expert on any of this, Sarwar, and especially in the area that you're talking about. I probably know a little more than most people because of my experience starting out as a in Vietnam as a soldier in 1968.
Yes.
But I think the answer to your question, and I think it's probably deserves a lot of attention because I think there's some complications to it on both sides of the argument.
Absolutely.
That I'd say a little of both. Definitely that they are building a military system that protects their country, that secures them. I understand that. We do the same thing. Most countries in the world do, because all countries respond in their own self-interest. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we do. So certainly it is the first option that you talked about. About a global power, as you watch this, for example, they have just built their third aircraft carrier. Well, our military would say, well, if they're not interested in being a global power, why would they continue to build aircraft carriers?
Right.
If it's just protecting their country, their borders, and they are doing that very effectively. I met with President Xi 3 times in 2014, summer of 2014. And those meetings, all 3 were centered around what the Chinese were doing in the South China Sea, East China Sea, is, building up those rocks.
Right.
And they were lying about why they were doing it. They were saying, well, this is just economic, give our trading partners opportunities to use those islands and so on. And that wasn't true. And I showed him photographs, satellite photographs of what the Chinese were doing. They were building up those islands,
right,
building runways for their jets, and then building housing for their jets. They were building ports and harbors for their submarines and their ships, all the way down south and on South China Sea. And I said to President Xi, the United States will always honor freedom of navigation. We must. Every country has agreed to that. Freedom of navigation. There's been no country that's ever challenged that. And in our modern lifetime, certainly since World War II, and we can't allow anything but freedom of navigation to occur. And we're pretty serious about that. Well, those were not happy meetings that I had with President.
I'm sure.
But that also tells you a little bit where they are using their military. So that's why I say I think it's both in many ways. And I think you're going to continue to see China build their forces. They have a very sophisticated force, because one thing that they have that they don't have to do, that the United States does have to do in our budgets, is that we continue to maintain what we refer to as legacy weapons. These are ships and planes that are 50 years old, 45 years old, that are out of date. We should mothball them and use the money that we continue to maintain maintenance for them for new state-of-the-art weaponry. That's what the Chinese do. So the Chinese have state-of-the-art weaponry, the most sophisticated, the best stuff out there, because they don't have to spend any of their money on anything else. We spend a lot of our defense dollars on these platforms.
Right.
And so if you look at their numbers as far as how much they spend, a third on a military budget, and that's not accurate, by the way. They spend more than that. They hide it.
I bet.
In different ways. I mean, there's no transparency in the Chinese government, but they spend a lot more than what they say they spend. So that's a dynamic here, also of part of the equation and the answer to your question.
So Secretary Hagel, what I've been doing for quite a while now, as you know, is talking to people, writing reports for the Foreign Policy Association, that given all of these tensions and given all of these strongly held beliefs on each side, I mean, I still continue to believe that this is going to be the most consequential relationship of the 21st century, right? So I'm ending this program the way I end the program with the people from China and other parts of Asia by asking you, so if you had a few minutes alone in private with President Xi Jinping, what would you tell him? Move ahead.
Well, I think one of the things I would do is emphasize what you just said. This relationship is going to be the most consequential relationship of the 21st century. How our two countries develop, how we engage each other, how we direct our relationships, how we get along, how we deal with differences, is going to mean the difference between a disastrous 21st century and a 21st century that need not be a 21st century where we both agree on everything. That's impossible. I mean, we don't agree with our best allies on everything. But we've got to be wise enough to sustain a working relationship, certainly with each other, that allows the world not just to survive, but to prosper, for all nations to prosper, for all nations to get better, all nations to recognize each other and the rights of each other. I mean, it starts with the basic respect of people. It's all people. It's the Chinese, it's the Americans, it's the Vietnamese, it's the British. It doesn't make any difference who you are, but for this world to survive in this century, it's going to be much related to and depend on the Chinese-American relationship. And that's what I would say to President Xi, and I'm sure President Xi understands that.
Well, Secretary Hagel, as educational as this has been, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. So I want to profusely thank you for taking part in this discussion and agreeing to appear on Polaris Live.
Thank you, Sarwar. It's been a real pleasure. Always great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode in this special series of programs in which 7 experts from China, the US, and the Middle East will talk about the Chinese Communist Party conference in Beijing, U.S.-China relations, and what that means for the rest of the world. So I hope to see you again. Until then, goodbye.